Thanks for tuning in to the Women's Vibrancy Code, a podcast dedicated to helping women move from exhausted to energized, balance their hormones, and feeling turned on by their life, their lover, and themselves. I'm your host, Maraya Brown. I'm a Yale and functional medicine trained women's health expert, midwife, mom, keynote speaker, and self-made entrepreneur. I'm the founder of my signature program, the Women's Vibrancy Code. So sit back, relax, and let's chat about your energy, hormones, libido, and embracing your feminine power. Oh, and you might want to have pen and paper to take some notes on some of these episodes. Welcome to the Women's Vibrancy Code podcast, where I'm committed to bringing you the tools, insights, and experts to help you thrive in your body, your energy, and your life. I'm Maraya Brown. Since January of 2022, I've released weekly episodes filled with powerful conversations and expert insights. I can't wait to continue this journey with you. And as we head towards 2025, it feels like the perfect time to revisit some of the most impactful, top listened to episodes from the past 2 years. From guest experts like Allison Armstrong, diving deep into relationships and core values, to Dr. Vincent Pedre sharing cutting-edge wisdom on gut health. These episodes are packed with the gold you've been asking for. We've covered everything from menstrual rhythms and hormonal balance to unpacking the big questions around passion, connection, and libido. And trust me, you don't want to miss the episode on DHEA, your brain on the pill. This podcast is for the visionary woman who's ready to feel spectacular, take full ownership of her health, and boldly reject the status quo. If you're tired of quick fixes and Band-Aid solutions, you're in the right place. So enjoy these powerful episodes as we wrap up 2024 and get ready for even more in 2025. Thank you for being here, and let's keep thriving together. I have Sarah Hill with us, who is a PhD. She earned from the University of Texas, and she's currently a researcher and professor at TCU. She wrote a book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. So we are going to be having a conversation about how our brains respond to being on the pill. So let's get into this. So a little bit more about Dr. Sarah Hill. She's currently a researcher, like I said. Her research on women, health, and sexual psychology has garnered more than $500,000 in grant funding and has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Scientific America, The Economist, and many others. Makes my palms sweat. I mean, we're in the presence of greatness, my friends. Most recently, Sarah has authored This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, The Surprising Science of Women, Hormones, and the Law of Unintended Consequences. I have the link in the description. It's the Amazon link if you want to grab her book. I'm telling you, it's worth the read. And this book has been published in several languages around the world and featured on TV shows like Today and Great Britain's This Morning. So, Sarah, Dr. Hill, thank you so much for your time and welcome. I have lots and lots and lots of questions. I did my nurse practitioner training at Yale, and so often it was, here's their symptom, put them on the pill. Here's their other symptom, switch them to a different pill. Here's a new symptom. How about hormone replacement therapy? So I'm wondering first, can you just give us the foundation of how does the birth control pill work?
The birth control pill works by actually suppressing the activities of the HPG axis. And it does this by providing your body with the daily supply of synthetic progesterone, or what's known as a progestin. And then sometimes, like with a combination birth control pill, for example, this is accompanied with also a dose of synthetic estrogen. And so this hormonal profile that you're taking every day and putting into your body every day is something that sends a message to the brain that suspends the activities of the HPG. Getting a daily dose of hormones like this makes the brain think that it's in the luteal phase of the cycle, which is a phase of the cycle in which the brain is actually not stimulating the ovaries. Because when hormone levels in the body are low, what happens is the brain starts to initiate this chain of events that leads to stimulation of the ovaries, which leads to egg development and all of that and ovulation. But when hormone levels, especially levels of progesterone, are high, that sends a signal to the brain that an egg has already been released. You're in the luteal phase of the cycle. And so the ovaries aren't being stimulated. And so the birth control pill sort of mimics this by giving you a daily dose of a relatively high level of synthetic progesterone. It's telling the brain, don't stimulate the ovaries. And that's why you don't ovulate when you're on the pill. And so it's essentially giving you a hormonal message that's incompatible or inconsistent with ovulation. And so that ceases ovulation. And it also causes some changes within like cervical fluid and that sort of thing that makes conception more difficult. But generally, the primary mechanism of action is the suppression of the HPG axis, which prevents ovulation and then, of course, prevents pregnancy.
Awesome. Okay. So we go on the pill, which generally is synthetic estrogen and progesterone. It tells the brain pretty much to stop ovulating, to think that the hormones are there. I don't know if you're in agreement with this. I love Laura Brydon says that ovulation is the main event. Like ovulation is what is going to be the thing that stimulates all of our hormonal cocktail. So we're now turning ovulation off, which for those of us who aren't wanting to get pregnant, I mean, I love that you highlight in your book the amazingness of contraception becoming available for women. And stopping ovulation is going to help us not get pregnant if we're not wanting to get pregnant. And it's also now impacting stopping ovulation, which has lots of other. You mentioned HPG. Can you, for those who don't understand HPG, can you highlight a little bit on what that is?
Yeah, no, I should know better than that. This is essentially your brain ovarian communication pathway. So it's short for hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, but it's just really the communication pathway between your brain and your ovaries.
Mm-hmm. And for those of you that are accustomed to listening to me, I often mention the HPA axis. So the hypothalamic pituitary and adrenal. And obviously the pituitary is now communicating with the gonadal and our ovaries, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, we're now taking the hormones that our body naturally is producing and giving them in synthetic form and telling the body, oh, you don't need to ovulate.
Right. Yeah, essentially, because the body is creating this state that reads to the brain into the pituitary gland, like you're in the luteal phase of the cycle, which is the phase of the cycle after an egg has been released, where the body is just waiting to see whether an embryo implants. And so during that time, the brain in the pituitary, they don't stimulate the ovaries because they're just waiting to see what's going to happen with that last one that was released. And so it keeps you in this perpetual state of having a relatively high level of the sex hormone progesterone. But of course, it's a synthetic, it's a progestin, but it gets picked up by progesterone receptors enough that it fools the brain and it fools the pituitary into not stimulating the ovaries. But like, as you noted, when you prevent ovulation from happening, which is what this process does, it does prevent pregnancy because the body is just not producing eggs, which you have to admit is really brilliant. I mean, the whole idea of like preventing yourself from getting pregnant but not ovulating is really interesting and cool. And as you noted, and I spend a lot of time talking about in my book, this has been an absolute force in women's lives in terms of our ability to gain financial and political independence for men and being able to long-term plan, because we can feel pretty certain that we're not going to get pregnant when we don't want to. But on the other hand, when you don't ovulate, I mean, that is the way that your body produces hormones. That's the primary mechanism by which women's bodies produce estrogen and progesterone. And even though we don't think about sex hormones as being really important for anything other than our periods and pregnancy, they actually play a really important role in our sense of ourself and our vitality and our sexual energy, and all of that is very much influenced by our levels of sex hormones. And so, taking the birth control pill and suppressing our body's sort of natural hormone factory does have a range of consequences on women's lives.
Absolutely. And so now when ideally we would be producing these hormones on our own, they're being given to us, our bodies stop being the ovulation, which is the main event. And so now what's happening in our brain instead?
Right. Yeah. And normally for a naturally cycling woman, if you look at sex hormones and what generally goes on over the course of a cycle, there's a real ebb and flow between the dominance of women's two primary sex hormones. So during the follicular phase of the cycle, which is starting the day you get your period up until the day that you ovulate, which generally happens, somewhere between like day 10 and 15. And during that time, that's an estrogen dominant phase of the cycle. So women go through this period of having relatively high levels of estrogen, which is something that's associated with feeling sexual desire and feeling sexy and feeling energetic. And women are they feel sharper and more outgoing, and they're higher in psychology. There's this term called sensation seeking. They just want stimulus. And so that's your estrogen dominant phase of your cycle. And then the luteal phase of the cycle, after ovulation has occurred, you get these relatively high levels of progesterone. And this is something that's associated with being a little sleepier, being hungrier, and not feeling as much sexual desire. And so when you take hormonal contraception and it's stuck in this like consistent state of progesterone or progestin dominance, this is something that it is going to change how women feel, because for a naturally cycling woman, there's going to be an ebb and a flow between, experiencing estrogen and all of its effects, and then feeling progesterone and all of its effects. And then with hormonal birth control, in addition to taking this daily, and we'll talk about the sort of specifics of what we know about the birth control pill and its influence on women's psychology and the way they experience the world, but even just suppressing women's own sex hormones in a way where they never get to experience some of the benefits that women get from this estrogen dominant phase of the cycle, which again is a time when women tend to feel pretty good about themselves and their sexual desire tends to be higher. They tend to have more sex and they tend to have more energy. They feel more vibrant and attuned to their environment. And women who are on hormonal birth control don't have those effects. And that's what the research shows. It shows that women who are on hormonal birth control tend to there's an increased risk of low sexual desire, sexual dysfunction, general, just decreased sexual motivation. They don't feel as sexy. They're not as in tune with sort of that side of themselves as naturally cycling women are. And there's also research showing that there's a diminution of vibrancy when you're on hormonal birth control, where you just don't quite feel as alive and in a three-dimensional way. And so those are just some of the effects that we find with hormonal birth control. A lot of that probably has to do with just not getting all those benefits that you do get from ovulation.
Yeah. Well, and I want to say out loud, for some of you who might be thinking, oh, the pill, I'm on a progesterone only pill, or I just get the Depo shot, or I'm only on hormone replacement therapy. And can you just speak to, we're not just talking about, the little pill packs where someone's taking both estrogen and progesterone, but this is synthetic hormones, not bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, but synthetic hormones kind of on a broad stroke, correct?
Yeah. I mean, whenever, in my book, when I talk about the effects of the birth control pill, I'm just talking about the effects of all forms of hormonal contraception, including ones that are used in a palliative way for women during the perimenopausal transition, where they're, trying to suppress the activities of women's own sex hormones and, again, replacing them with these synthetics in a way to try to treat some of the unpleasant physiological symptoms that can go on with perimenopause.
Right. So palliative meaning, what's your symptom? Here's your drug.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let's say, like, for instance, for me, I was on the birth control pill in my early 20s and then, stopped at age 25. And I've always used fertility awareness method since then. And it's really worked for me. And I love feeling my endogenous hormones doing what they need to be doing and tracking and paying attention. Now, because I have a history of being on the birth control, can you talk a little bit about the changes in the brain? And are we talking permanent changes? Like, what is the influence that we're seeing if a woman has ever taken synthetic hormones?
No, and that's a really great question, and it's an important one. And, if you give hormonal birth control or synthetic hormones to women after they're done with brain development, so, like, let's say a 25-year-old woman who's on these pills, the effects are going to be more or less, we should expect them to be what we would call activational. And what that means is that it's like, here, now you see it, now you don't. So while you're on the birth control pill, you experience these differences in the way that your brain is operating and the way that you experience the world. But after you discontinue use, within a couple of months, you'll be back to sort of quote unquote normal. And I say a couple of months because you do get dynamic changes across your lifetime in levels of things like hormone receptors. If you've been on hormonal birth control for any period of time and then you discontinue it, it will take your brain a little bit of time to adjust with the number of hormone receptors that it has. And because for that reason, it can take women a couple of cycles sometimes after they've been off of hormonal birth control to feel like themselves again. For some women, it can take several months, but more or less, you can expect that things will go back like business as usual. Where we don't really know, and this is something that I think is not talked about enough, and I think is incredibly important, is what goes on when we give hormonal birth control to adolescent girls. So these are girls who are like, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, these young girls whose brains are still in prime brain development mode. Your brain is still developing up until the time you're about 25, but it's done most of the heavy lifting is done by the time you're 20. And so after that, I'm a little bit less concerned, but especially like, 19, 18, 17, 16, and especially these young girls, because I know my daughter is 14 and she has contemporaries whose parents have put them on hormonal birth control for, regulating their cycles or their skin breaking out. Their brains are still developing. And when you're talking about post-pubertal brain development, generally, like what's going on during that pubertal transition as your brain is developing from its childlike state into a grown-up brain, the primary like architect in that remodeling project are your sex hormones, right? So your sex hormones play an important role in this this pubertal transition brain reorg. And we don't know how birth control pills affect that. We've spent most of our human history with girls going through the, pubertal transition with their naturally cycling hormones. And that's like what brain development is like used to. And so we don't know how the pill affects brain development and if it does and to what degree. And there's no reason to expect that it won't. There's no way it doesn't. We just don't know whether or not it's meaningful. Like we don't know whether or not it causes like meaningful differences in girls' brains. And this is like a very important question. Almost no research has been done on it. And yet we're giving girls these birth control pills without really thinking twice about the fact that hormones do a lot more than just influence whether or not we're getting our period. They do all sorts of things. And especially when we're talking about people whose brains are still developing, they're pretty important. And there is some research now that's come out. There's a paper that was published in 2019 that found that girls who were using hormonal birth control, so ever users of hormonal birth control during adolescence, they found that years later, after these women had discontinued use, that they were at a significantly higher rate of developing major depressive disorder than girls who were never users of hormonal birth control. And this is just one study, and we need to see a lot more. But it was a pretty compelling paper. They did a really nice job of controlling for a lot of extraneous variables that could have sort of come into play in terms of that association. But I do think that we should be cautious because we don't know.
Well, and I'm thinking, what I remember reading is kind of this idea of it sending the adrenals into hyperdrive and just pumping cortisol out nonstop. And how is that affecting the brain? I'm wondering, just from a hypothetical standpoint, obviously we need more research, but what are some of the hypotheses that could be the long-term influence on the brain, having girls aged 13 to 19 on hormonal contraception for regulating their cycles or acne or mood disorders, whatever it may be? So I heard major depressive disorder. What else are kind of things that researchers are wondering about?
When we look at some of the literature looking at brain differences between people who are using hormonal birth control and then those who are not on hormonal birth control, we know that they, for example, have a smaller hypothalamus. We know that they have a shrunken hippocampus. We know that they tend to have less structural connectivity. It can change structural and functional connectivity in the brain. And so these sorts of things that we see going on sort of in real time with current users of birth control, when we're thinking about how, what are some differences that we might see in terms of long-term effects, like developmental effects on younger girls, I would look at these same brain regions. For example, the hypothalamus, which is the sort of center of your brain that is a really important in terms of communicating with your ovaries and other sort of hormonal touch points in your body, also your adrenal glands. I would expect that we're going to get some differences there because these girls aren't getting, these big changes in estrogen and progesterone, these dynamic waxing and waning like you do with naturally cycling girls. And so I would imagine that this probably changes the way that the hypothalamus develops. And it's also possible that the hippocampus, given that they found evidence of hippocampal shrinkage in pill-taking women compared to non-pill-taking women. And the hippocampus is part of your brain that's associated with learning and memory, but it also seems to be related in a lot of ways to mood. And this is something that could potentially be playing a role in that increased risk of every user or, these ever users during adolescence of hormonal birth control and then mood-related problems. It could cause long-term structural changes to the functioning of the HPG axis. So again, the brain ovarian axis, but also the brain adrenal axis. So the stress response. And so there's a lot of different ways that it could potentially be influencing developmental outcomes.
I'm thinking PTSD, I'm thinking anxiety, I'm thinking infertility.
And we just
cancers, can we even take that leap with estrogen dependent cancers? And there's a lot of unknowns there, but it seems like there's a lot of places that we could go. Yeah, no,
when you think about, I could go, but it gets really speculative because there's just not research on this. And I think that it's always really tricky business when you give adolescents anything that can influence brain chemistry or brain development, because and they don't do the research on the antidepressants and all these other things that they give there's not a lot of research on what that does to brain development. And it's really upsetting to me. It's so upsetting to me that doctors are and they're not all this way. There's very many very thoughtful doctors, but just this idea that your brain is still developing, and that will just give people medication without actually having any good research showing what the long-term developmental consequences
and even
are.
Women in their 20s and 30s and 40s and thinking about post-birth control syndrome. And can you talk a little bit about this idea of what's happening in the adrenal system when a woman is on hormonal contraception, and this, what I'm understanding is an overdrive of cortisol production without the negative feedback loop. And so now women are just in this, like, everyone at this point has probably heard of adrenal fatigue, adrenal exhaustion. And when we're being given these exogenous pharmaceutical hormones, and it's sending our cortisol, our fight, flight, or freeze hormone, into overdrive without that feedback pause. Am I understanding this correctly? Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah. And let me just be real clear on that. Nobody really knows exactly what's going on. It doesn't seem like there's a real clear picture of exactly what's going on, but I can tell you like what all the different pieces are. There's a lot of research that's been coming out since like the 1990s that finds that women who are on hormonal birth control have a blunted or absent cortisol response to stress. And so, normally when most of us are experiencing something stressful, within about, 5 or 6 minutes of the stressor sort of hitting us, like whether it's sitting in traffic or we're giving a presentation or whatever it is, our body will start releasing the stress hormone cortisol. And cortisol is something that when we're experiencing it during acute stress is actually incredibly adaptive. It's part of how our body regulates, copes with, and learns from stress. But the thing about cortisol is that when it's being released in the long term, like if you're just chronically getting cortisol release, it's actually really bad for the body. And that's because cortisol, what it does when we're experiencing something stressful is it takes all of the resources that the body is using for everything else that it's doing, cell repair, your immune response, growth, digestion. It takes all of those resources and redirects them to the stress response, right? So it does things like it dumps a bunch of fat and sugar into your bloodstream. It causes the birth of new neurons in your hippocampus so that way you'll remember things. It's getting you ready to mobilize energy and make a quick getaway if you need to make a quick getaway. But that diversion of all the body's resources means that you're not repairing your cells and your immune system isn't, going and this and that and the other thing. And so what happens is if you get chronic release of cortisol, your body actually shuts down the stress response. It says, forget this. Like we can't suspend the immune system. We can't suspend immune function and cell repair, and we can't do that indefinitely. So forget you, stress, we're just not even we're not going to cope with stress anymore. And that's what you see with chronic stress is you'll get people where you get this adrenal fatigue, right? Where essentially your body just shuts down the stress response because it's being chronically stressed. And when the body shuts the stress response down, you get a blunted cortisol response to stress, just like what we find with women who are on hormonal birth control.
And today's episode is brought to you by Maraya Brown and our very own The Women's Vibrancy Code for ambitious individuals who want to create impact, legacy, and vibrancy without burnout. If you want to feel more energized, get to the root cause of your brain fog, hormonal challenges, and lack of sleep while turning up your passion, check out the Women's Vibrancy Code. Link is in the description. And I also have a couple free giveaways. So grab my free adaptogen elixir recipes and menstrual tracker by visiting me over on Instagram at _Maraya Brown _. That's MARAYA Brown. And put an underscore before and after the name over on Instagram. Click on the link in my bio and you are welcome to grab both of those free resources. Drink the adaptogen elixirs each and every day. Track your cycle, not just your menses, for about 3 months or more, and watch how much more spectacular you feel when your body is better adapting to stress and you're honoring your dynamic, rhythmic nature. These two resources used to be exclusively for program participants, and now I am happy to say that I offer them as free downloads. So go over to Instagram, grab them. You're welcome to reach out to me at any point. Can't wait to hear how you're enjoying them, how you like the flavors, and what big takeaways you're experiencing by tracking not just your menses, but all of the dynamic things that change each and every month. With that, ta-ta for now.
It's crazy that most people have absolutely no idea. Like, I had no idea that this went on until I was in a research talk about something else completely. It was about stress, because I'm interested in stress. It's something that we study in my lab. And the person who was giving the presentation just mentioned that they only analyzed full data on the men in their sample, because most of the women in their sample were on hormonal birth control. And women who are on hormonal birth control don't have a cortisol response to stress. And then he just went on and started talking about the rest of his study. And I was just like, well, shut up about that. Like, can you get back to the thing about the women on the pill? Because that's too weird. And then I went and dug in the literature, and sure enough, people have been publishing on it for decades. And there's other research showing that every piece of the sort of brain, pituitary, adrenal signal is dysregulated in pill takers. Like, wow. The message that goes from the brain to the pituitary isn't right. The message that goes from your pituitary to your adrenal glands isn't right. Women's bodies just aren't responding to any level of their stress response. Like, when it comes to the sort of the HPA axis portion of their stress response, the way that other women are. And it's not in a way that feels good. Like, women don't feel less stress when they're on birth control pills compared to when they're off of it. It's just that their stress response isn't working. And so they're less able to actually cope with stress, which could potentially be something that contributes to some of the mental health side effects that we tend to see on women who are on hormonal birth control.
And I can't help but think about thyroid dysfunction. If it's true that levothyroxine is the most prescribed medication for women in the United States, and we know the pituitary is not only communicating with the ovaries, but also our thyroid.
Yeah.
Isn't that theoretically also impacting what percentage of women have been on some form of hormonal contraception?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. It would not surprise me. And that was a link that, I'm a psychologist. And so, and what's really interesting is you'd think that there would be a lot of research looking at the links between like thyroid hormone levels and psychological experiences and that sort of thing, because the thyroid is so important in like energy and these other really important things. There's not a lot of research. And so I hadn't even like put the connections together with like, wow, I wonder what this is doing to the thyroid and then how this influences how people feel. But some other folks after my book was released who were physicians, because they're generally the ones who deal with, thyroid, psychologists, not so much. And the more I was, got into it, because I started doing a little bit of digging around. And yeah, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that there's some thyroid birth control links. I don't know what they are, but I would assume that it has some effect on thyroid function, at least during time of use. And again, with some of these things, like we don't know if these effects are long-term or.
Right. So then what about, do all women's bodies respond the same way to whether they're on the pill, progesterone only contraception, synthetic hormone replacement therapy? Is it fair to say everyone is kind of responding the same way?
No. I mean, it is absolutely idiosyncratic. And this is something that makes it difficult. And it makes it difficult in a lot of ways. It makes it difficult for physicians. And I think if you talk to any physician, they'll tell you that this is absolutely the case. They have a hard time knowing what to prescribe to what person, because they're going to get what effect. And each one of us responds a little bit differently, because each one of us has different sort of pre-existing levels of endogenous sex hormones. Each one of us has different levels, and sometimes even different types of hormone receptors, right? Some people have like they recently found this gene that's associated with this Neanderthal progesterone receptor. So some people have Neanderthal progesterone receptors and others have these we have different types of hormone receptors. We have different numbers of hormone receptors. And the way that we metabolize hormones is all a little bit different based on our unique body chemistry. And so no two of us respond the same way. And there's almost 100 different formulations of hormonal birth control that are out there in the world. And so you take all of these individual differences in how we respond, and then you add all of those different types of birth control pills that are out there. I mean, you get something, it's a real mix. And this is one of the reasons that doctors are so, that's not a side, weight gain isn't a side effect. And you'll have women going in and they're like, no, I gained 10 pounds. Like, it's a side effect for me. And it was a pill. And when you look at the literature, you'll see, and just to use the weight gain example, some women do gain substantial amounts of weight. It's just that the overall population mean, there's no difference, because some women also lose a substantial amount of weight. And it's because you're changing hormones. And what that change means, if you and I go on the same thing, for you, it could be raising your hormone levels. But for me, it could be really lowering my hormone levels. And so we're going to respond totally differently to those things. Mm-hmm. And because of this, I think it's so important that women, if they're going to be on hormonal birth control, or, even if, and if they're not going to be on hormonal birth control too, certainly is really understand yourself, and understand what isn't happening with yourself, and always trust what your body is telling you, because just because something isn't on a side effect label somewhere doesn't mean that your experiences aren't real if you're having them, because we do all respond very differently, and no two women are going to respond the same way. And so your side effect, even if it's not on the package label, it's probably real. Yeah. Hormones influence everything. And,
listen to what your body is telling you.
Yeah. Well, I think because we've been gaslighted by medicine for so long, I think that women have gotten to this place where, we tend to doubt ourselves, oh, well, maybe it's not a big deal, or, oh no, maybe I'm imagining it, or, oh, this just must be me. And it's no, well, that matters. You matter. What you're going through matters, and how you feel matters. And it is real. And I think that we need to be reminded of that as often as possible, because we're disreminded of that so frequently by the medical establishment.
Well, and I hear so often women say, I don't feel right. And I've gone in and my doctor said my labs are normal. So, yeah. Or all the women that have said, I was told it's just in my head. It's no, we have to continue to advocate for ourselves. So I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about libido and this whole vibrant conversation with the follicular and luteal phase and pheromones. But before I go there, is it fair? Would you say that you are an anti-birth control pill person? What can we talk about contraception? And would you say, okay, we shouldn't go on the pill, and then what do we do instead? Or how would you answer that question?
Well, I think that the answer is very different for every woman. I don't think that the birth control pill is evil. I think in a lot of cases, it's the best thing that women have, honestly. If I was 20 and if I was myself at 20 all over again, knowing everything that I know now, I would probably still be on hormonal birth control, at least for that period of time in my life when I really needed it. My periods, despite the fact that I'm a health nut and I exercise and I eat, when I was younger, they weren't particularly regular. They're super regular now, and they've gotten more so as I gotten, past my mid-20s. I got very regular, but before then there was absolutely no way I could have really done a thoughtful, and I was not a thoughtful, I was 20, done, something like fertility awareness method well. And some of the other options I'm not crazy about. My body is very sensitive to, latex and gels and all of these other things that a person might use for non-hormonal birth control. And so I don't think that the pill is bad. I think that it comes with a lot of trade-offs. And at certain points in my life, it made sense to make those trade-offs. And then at other points in my life, it didn't. Like right now, it doesn't. And I'm able to use fertility awareness method and without any problems at all. And it's very, intuitive for me. But there was a time in my life when that would not have been a good choice. And so, I think that we need to protect keeping it available to women. We also just need to make sure that women have all of the information so that way they know the trade-offs they're making when they're making them. The thing that is upsetting is that I think a lot of women go through these experiences of experiencing side effects. They don't know what's happening. They don't even have a language to describe it to their doctor in a real way. And they're asked to make these decisions about their bodies without all of this information. And I have a real problem with that. And so I wrote, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, to give women that information. And again, not in a way to try to say, well, don't do this, it's terrible and horrible. Instead to say, here's the trade-offs you're making. And they're pretty steep. I wouldn't want to be on it now, because I like how I feel when I'm off of it a lot better than I like how I feel when I'm not.
Yeah. And oh my gosh, I could ask, I don't know how much time you have, but would you just touch briefly on post-birth control syndrome? Is that something that you could just touch on?
Sure. So post-birth control syndrome is just referring to that period of time when your body is transitioning back from being somebody who was on synthetics. And again, with synthetics, you get this same level of hormones every day. And it's synthetic progestins hitting you over the head, and really low levels of estrogen. And so when your body starts to cycle again, and your brain is telling your ovaries to do their thing, and your ovaries are starting to release and mature and release eggs, and they're releasing these hormones, your body goes through a little bit of a period of adjustment because you don't have the right number of hormone receptors. Your, hypothalamus hasn't really been used in a while because it hasn't been having to communicate with the pituitary. I mean, you're using your hypothalamus for other things. I'm being a little bit simplistic in my language, but I mean, it's your hypothalamus hasn't done that in a long time. I mean, your body has to make a lot of adjustments. And there's certain types of nutritional deficiencies that can occur in birth control pills. Your microbial composition changes as you're transitioning off of birth control pills. I mean, your body's undergoing a lot of changes that are being initiated by changing your hormonal milieu to this sort of, really steady stream of synthetic hormones to having to produce their own, and then having to sort of manage that. And as women are sort of transitioning between that period of being a pill taker to being a natural cycler, it can be associated with things like fatigue and mood roller coasters and women just not feeling like themselves. And this period of time can generally it can take a month, it can take a couple of months, it can take several months. And so it's just, it's that period that we control. And
I realize we keep saying pill, but there's vaginal rings, there's creams. When you think about hormone replacement therapy from a synthetic perspective, there's vaginal creams, there's a patch, right? There's all different ways in which these synthetic hormones are being administered. So when the term the pill is being used, just for all of you out there listening, and you're like, oh, but I'm into menopause and I'm just taking hormone replacement therapy, or I'm just doing a patch or a vaginal ring, or I'm just doing the depot shot. These are all kind of in the same category. Fair to say?
Well, yes and no. So I'll say yes, absolutely with the synthetics, but with things like a estrogen patch, for example, we're not going to see the dysregulated stress response in women who are on an estrogen patch. Or because the sort of thing that seems to be causing the dysregulation in the stress response seems to be the progestins that are in the hormonal birth control. And so it's that synthetic progesterone that's the real bugger in terms of a lot of the symptoms. But yeah, I mean, hormonal IUD, the vaginal ring, the shot, the implant, any of these things that contain a progestin, that's what we're talking about here. And I always say the pill because it's just nice and easy breezy shorthand. but really talking about hormonal contraception.
And so if someone's being given bioidentical progesterone or prometrium, that's a different conversation.
That is a different conversation. And, I would expect that you're going to get, progesterone can make women feel a little funky. It makes you a little sleepy and kind of, drowse. I don't know, get your energy level kind of, and it can also have libido side effects. With which, birth control pills, we know that women tend to have reduced one of the sort of more frequent side effects is reductions in libido as well as sexual response. So the pill can be associated with reductions in things like lubrication. Women have reported clitoral shrinkage, especially on the hormonal IUD. You get, some issues with, I've heard women reporting issues with orgasms. And all of this is believed to be related. It's in part you're suppressing estrogen. It's in part you get these synthetic progestins, and then your body starts, because these synthetic hormones the body doesn't quite know what to do with them. It tends to release a lot of sex hormone binding globulins, and that actually binds up a lot of testosterone. And that's also a big sort of issue for women who are on hormonal birth control in terms of being the cause of some of the negative side effects that they get, is because a lot of their testosterone is being bound up by these binding globulins, which make it inactive, leading women who are on hormonal birth control, their levels of sort of available testosterone is about 60 to 65% lower than naturally cycling women's. And this is obviously not great for things like sexual desire and sexual functioning for women.
It's such important information for all of us to hear. I would just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing out in the world. Thank you for publishing your book. Thank you for contributing educational articles and for helping us to start this process of saying, okay, we are grateful that we're able to take more control of our fertility and move into the workforce and have all of this amazing progress that's taken place. And wait a minute, can we step back and also look at how this is actually impacting the development of adolescent and teenage girls' brains, and how it's actually impacting our stress response, our gut health, our immune system, our cellular development, our increase in weight, our insulin resistance, it goes on, our libido. It seems kind of endless.
Yeah.
And so where does a woman go if she's going, well, if my doctor, this is kind of the only thing my doctor has suggested for me, starting by reading your book seems like a next step. Do you have any suggestions for other next steps for a woman who's saying, okay, wait, well, and you can also enroll in my workshop. We're going to be doing a lot of conversation and stay tuned in with Beyond the Red Tent and continue to receive education. But Dr. Hill, is there anything else that you would recommend for a woman to start taking steps in just empowering herself, learning more, and finding different resources for other options along her health journey?
Yeah, I think that really learning about your body and your cycle and your fertility in a way that will allow you, first of all, to just understand how you work, I think is a really important step, because then that's also going to allow you to make really informed decisions about whether you want to try to work with that or do you want to suppress that. And, and there's a lot of great resources for this. I write about it in my book. There's other really great books that are out there that teach women about their cycles. Something like Laura Bryden's Period Repair Manual is a really good one. Taking Charge of Your Fertility. Everybody loves that book. And it's something that, most women don't read that until they're trying to get pregnant, but it's a nice crash course on your cycle and how your fertility actually works. Really educating yourself on your fertility so that way you sort of know what that is and understand how all of that works, I think is important. I like the idea of taking your workshop. But if I'm telling you, if your doctor is only saying that there's only hormonal birth control and you're looking for something to regulate your cycles, that's just not the case. And looking at or as a way to prevent pregnancy, that's just not the case. And I would try to maybe either find a different doctor or, really get a handle on what your other options are. And there are other non-hormonal options. There's a copper IUD, there's a diaphragm, there's barrier methods like condoms, there's things like FexiGel, there's fertility awareness method. And so it's not like, we're not like totally lost in terms of
vasectomy. Like we could also, if we're in long-term relationships and we know we don't want to have more children, we can also put the responsibility. It doesn't always have to be on our shoulders.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And they are reversible. And so, vasectomy is a good choice. I mean, there's other options besides just hormonal birth control. And if you are thinking about going on it, I recommend, really educating yourself on the trade-offs that you're making, and not in a way, because I don't think that I don't think the information needs to be scary. I think that it needs to be about understanding the trade-offs that you're making. And that way, you know what to look out for, because each one of us responds a little bit differently. And so my book is certainly, when we talk about the psychological effects of the pill on women, it's not something that's necessarily prescriptive, or it's like, this is what's going to happen to you on the birth control pill. This is, blah. Instead, it's like, here's what we know from research. This can happen. This can happen. This can happen. This can happen. Here's how you know if trouble is happening. And so that way you can really monitor yourself. And if the pill that you're on isn't working, try a new one. And if that doesn't work, trying something else. And so it's just really, information.
Yes. Thank you again. Thank you so much for providing the information and giving the empowerment to women. So once again, we have Dr. Sarah Hill and her book, which I have the link up in the description. This is Your Brain on Birth Control, an absolute read that's worth your time.
Thank you.
I'm Maraya Brown, certified nurse midwife. We've got the Vibrant Life Workshop. And once again, we can learn all about ways to address our hormones and our exhaustion and our vitality and our libido and all of that from a non-pharmaceutical perspective. Not that the pill is always bad. There's definitely a place for it, and contraception is important, but can we at least explore other options, right? So for those teenage girls, for the women who are just trying to work through symptom relief, to actually go, well, wait a minute, maybe not just a pill, but are there other options? And can we make educated decisions about what is going to be happening in our body now, as well as in the long run, if we add in these synthetic pharmaceutical versions? So thank you so much for your time and for what you provide for the community.